Okay. And it says we're live. So yeah, so this is the topic of tonight's discussion is going to be you know, is the coming of Matthew 24, is it global or is it local? And this kind of like Jeremy just texted me, he told me he won't be able to make it tonight, but this kind of was inspired by him because he was going through, I think it was some kind of AI platform. It might have been Chat GTP, and he said, well, the East and the West, where especially he will gather them from the East and the West. Well, the East and the West are in plural, or in the plural form. Does that mean it's going to be an all-encompassing return? And Chat GPT said yes. And so he came out with a video. I didn't know he was going to come out with his own video, but he came out with a video. I just saw it earlier. And he said, yeah, but this is the deal. What kind of world were they? What was their world? Was it like a globe, like with North and South America? I mean, they didn't know. Their notions of geography were a lot more limited. At the same time, you could say it's global or local, or you could say, well, maybe it's both. So, anyways, I'm gonna shut up, and I'm just gonna open up the floor, and we could go around the room, and I guess we'll just do it clockwise. We'll start with you, Jeff. What do you think?
Yeah, I think what Jeremy did really got my juices flowing. I tell you, I just thought, man, he's got something there. But I don't know why East and West are plural. That I don't understand. I tried looking to find out about that, but I can't find anything on that. I think it's just the way the Greek constructs things. But as far as the and that most people would pronounce it Anatole, but it's Anatole in Greek, and that's the day spring from on high that Luke talks about, and that's what Jeremy's referring to. The east, the one coming from the east, is the Anatole. Well, now how is that related to Matthew 24? I mean, it doesn't really deal with the one coming from the east in Matthew 24, but it does talk about the east and the west. So he starts in the east and he flashes to the west. So it is a literal coming of the day spring from on high. And the way we know that is because in Luke, he's talking about the coming of the morning star or the day spring from on high. No one would doubt that that was a physical coming, right? That Jesus came physically as the day spring from on high. That's what Luke is saying. Well, in Revelation 22, the day spring comes from heaven. Again, that's the second coming. So why should we doubt that that's a not a physical coming? You know, he's the day spring. He comes from the east. So and since Matthew is referring to that in a totally different way by saying he flashes from the east to the west. Now, it's just different way of saying it. But you guys know who's the now I totally forgot his name. What's the guy's name that on eschatology? Philip Morrow. Philip Morrow divides the text, right? He divides the text at verse 27, where most preterists will divide the text at verse 33 and between 33 and 34, right? But Philip Morrow divides it. I used to do that too when I used to try to divide Matthew 24, but I don't do that anymore because I don't think you can divide it. Because look at that. You have two comings of the day spring. You have the birth of Christ, the first advent, and you have the second advent. So there's a lot of dualism in Scripture.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. Good opening. What do you think, Carmine? Eventually, what we'll do is eventually we'll go around the room once, and then we'll make it an open conversation. That way, we can just free flow it. What do you think, Carmine?
Yeah. So I saw the response that Jeremy had got from ChatGPT, and as I suspected, I didn't really think it would be that conclusive. And then in his follow-up video that he posted on his channel, he had some follow-up prompts that he'd put into ChatGPT about whether or not that was, a clincher or not, as far as the plurality of East and West. And it came back and said, no, it wasn't really a confirmation, despite what its original claim was. So, from my perspective, I believe that it is both simultaneously. It's both global and local. As I've frequently stated during discussions on this channel and elsewhere, I think Jesus was quite often speaking in a dual sense concerning his return. And I think that is backed up by a lot of evidence. Matthew 24 is one of those places. This chapter and the one preceding it have many indicators of duality in the context. About a month ago, right here on this channel, I presented a comprehensive overview of how Jesus used puns in key time statements concerning his return to imply that he intended his words to be understood from two different perspectives. Since his coming would bring about a judgment event that the Bible often refers to as a day of the Lord, Jesus patterned his speech concerning this event after the first such day of judgment spoken of in the Bible, and that is the day in which Adam died. Jesus was following the pattern of his father's speech, as God used a similar prophetic pun to imply that Adam would suffer two different deaths within 2 different days as a result of his sin. The same intent to imply duality by using puns is demonstrated in the descriptions that Jesus gives of the day of the Lord, in which he would also judge the earth on two much larger scales, ultimately reversing this double curse on Adam. So in both the judgment by God on Adam and the judgment of Jesus upon his return, both near-term and long-term judgment were being implied from the same language. In both cases, the consequences of the secondary reference was more complete than the first, and consequently, the first return of Christ implied in these verses was local, while the second implied return is global.
Okay, that's a good explanation. It's got a lot of detail. All right, Mike.
Leave it there for now, but
Yeah.
I welcome
Okay.
the opportunity to discuss any
Oh, well,
challenges or
we're gonna. Oh, yeah. There's gonna be challenges. I can, I can guarantee you that. In fact, Mike, he's probably gonna challenge all
yeah,
y'all's
I
view.
anticipate that.
Go ahead. Go ahead, Mike. What do you think?
Wow, it's an awesome opportunity. Really, I appreciate the platform. First and foremost, we obviously thank God through Christ, and having that foundation. I'm sure we all do. We are brothers, and I'm glad to have this cordial conversation. So, as someone who holds to fulfilled eschatology, I'm going to pretty much share a common view in that stream. So, I would just say, contextually, what you have is this theme in the New Testament, especially Matthew, starting with Matthew 3 with John the Baptist. And, he's talking to the Pharisees and listen, you guys better repent. In the Greek, it does use melio, and it talks about a wrath about to come. And so there's this kind of theme that plays out. And especially when you jump to Matthew 21 through 25, Matthew alludes to Daniel probably at least 8 or 9 times. And so that's where his lens is. And it's all going to be featured as his understanding of what the end of the age is. And it's all tied to the destruction of the temple. Clearly, if you look at Matthew 24, that's where it begins. And they ask privately, when will this happen? The sign of your coming, end of age. I see that as Semitic parallelism. 3 questions. Jews typically do that. It's not 3 separate questions tied to separate events, long periods of time. It's really about the same event dealing with the temple's destruction. And actually, if you look at the Greek Septuagint in Daniel 9, it actually paints a picture of the Messiah being cut off, and he will return. The one who had died, he'll return to join a prince to destroy the city and the sanctuary. So I think they're tying his parousia to that event. If you look at Matthew 22, it lays out a picture of, Matthew 21, the parable of 10, and you can start there. And the religious and political system, they're sitting in the seat of Moses, and basically God, through Christ, is going to mete out judgment. From the blood of Abel to Zechariah, judgment's coming upon them and that generation. So I kind of see that framework really tied to a local event. You have Matthew 22, where it reads, the king was enraged at this kind of persecution against those giving the invitation, basically extending the gospel message out. He will send his army, destroy those murderers, and burn that city. So this theme carries into Matthew 23, Matthew 24. And so I'm going to tie that all within that narrative. And you have a time statement that whatever you think that east of the west is, it's going to be geared towards something being done within that generation. I think that's hard to counter. And interestingly enough, I just encourage everyone to, what's up, Martin? Encourage everyone to watch. There's a documentary on the siege of Jerusalem, or the Roman Jewish War. So I see, first of all, when you go to Zechariah chapter 9, you go to Psalms 144, Habakkuk 3. We're not going to go into them. But this is apocalyptic language. God is often featured as coming using lightning to mete out judgment. And Christ in John 5 has been given that prerogative to judge. The Father says, I give judgment to the Son. And so what you have is Christ being represented by the Roman army. And if you just look at history and the documentary, if you want, or just read Josephus, first of all, you're dealing with about 80,000 soldiers. You're dealing with the Roman army, 4 legions, about 5 different vassal kings from around the empire, 20,000 auxiliary soldiers from around the empire. And you'll see that they're coming from they're going from the east to the west, the surrounding, the sieging the temple. And I think that's being fulfilled through the Roman army. And an interesting note, I'm not saying this is a definite connection, but the Fulminata was defeated kind of with Gaius at the original uprising of the Jews, in which Gaius and the soldiers are coming in to kind of take care of business, but they were kind of defeated. Well, the Fulminata joined that siege in 70 AD, and they were pissed. It's no coincidence that basically in the Greek, they were the lightning legion, and they had eagles and lightning on their, vestments. And they had the Aquila, which is the kind of symbol with the eagle. So that's why you have in Matthew 24, you have this idea of where the carcasses are, the eagles will gather. So I think you can easily tie it into the time statements that are offered. The audience relevance fits this kind of fulfilled eschatology, and you don't have to go past the Roman Jewish War. Everyone knew from around the empire that this kind of war was going on, and they would see the soldiers, the fires. So I'll end there, but thank you, guys.
Okay, and I want to say hi to Martin. Martin, it's been a little while since you've been here. I know you got some thoughts. Give us your thoughts on the question of whether it's local or global, and then what we'll do is we'll open it up. We'll just have an open conversation. We could challenge each other. We could, fill in the blanks. I don't think there'll be too many blanks, but go ahead, Martin. Tell us what you think.
So I think it's very important as we start off this to ask this question: what does the context itself say is a scope of the prophecy according to Matthew 24? Because what is clear is that the same Olivet Discourse is in Mark and it's in Luke, but there was only one question, which is about the destruction of the temple. However, in Matthew, what you have is, when is your coming, and when also is the end of the age, and when will the sign of these things be? So that what it's saying is that Matthew 24 is giving us a full scope of what the Olivet Discourse entails. So that the question that is being answered by Jesus is not simply the question about when the temple will be destroyed, but also about when the end of the age will be. And in the text, as we take a closer look at Matthew 24, the end of the age, I will say, is what drives the narrative. So much that this end of the age that Jesus has in view, it's clear that this is the same end of the age in Daniel chapter 12, verse 13, which according to Daniel is the time of the resurrection of the dead, including even Daniel himself, when he will receive his inheritance. But notice this end of the age is also when those who are the shine, who are turning many to righteousness, who are the wise, will shine as the what? Sun and the stars. This is the glorification of those who are the witnesses of Christ. And this immediately, this statement of their shining connected to Matthew 13, where Jesus says this will be the end of the age, when what will happen is it is the time when those who are wise will shine as the sun, meaning those who are the wise, who are the sons of the kingdom, are also the wheat. So that notice that this is the end of sowing. The sowing is the preaching of the gospel in the field, which is all the world according to the text. In Matthew 13, it said it's the end, it's the entirety of the cosmos. So what am I saying? From Daniel 12 and 13, it's very clear that the end of the age is the time of the resurrection, the time of the separation of the resurrection of both the righteous and the dead, and the unrighteous who are in the tomb. And Jesus tells us that it is all those who are dead, both the righteous and the dead, in the tomb. They come out of the grave, he says. And this is when the separation judgment, when the books are also open, and those who we have eternal life and eternal judgment. And that's therefore connect us directly to Daniel 7, which is the time of the sitting judgment, when the beast who was waging war will be destroyed. And this beast is the beast who is in Revelation chapter what? 11 and 13, who is a universal beast. So a few points. Matthew 24 clearly shows that the end of the ages in view is universal, in that it shows that it's the end of the sowing, by pointing out that it is the same time as the harvest, which connects itself to Joel 3, which is also the time of the judgment of all the gathered nations, when the judge will sit. And that is also the coming of the pierced one with his angels in Zechariah 12 and 14, which is also a judgment of nations who were gathered against Israel. So my point is, you have the resurrection of both the righteous and the judge. You have the glorification. You also have the end of the great tribulation, in which those who are being persecuted are the saints, who are the ones that the beast is waging war. And Revelation tells us this beast is a universal beast. And it ends up by saying, guess what? This is also the time of the sitting judgment, when the beast will be destroyed. And this beast is a universal beast. So what I'm getting at is this. Matthew 24 shows that it is the time of the end of the great tribulation. Is the end of the sowing of the seed, which is the preaching of the gospel to all the nations, which according to the Bible is the end of the Great Commission, which extends as the preaching by the what you will call the anointed witnesses in Isaiah 42, 49, 61. And that says that this is also the end of the restoration of fortunes, when God is gathering all his people from all the nations into his kingdom. So you will see all these facets coming out in Jesus' text in Matthew 24. Notice at the end, he speaks about his coming, and he will send and gather all the people from the four ends of the earth, right? That is a theme of the restoration. And then you will notice he also speaks about his coming on the clouds, and his coming as the pierced one. That is Zechariah 12. And then you have connected to this the coming of the angels. That's Zechariah 14. So all I'm saying is, you put all these texts together, the end of the age that Jesus has in view, and as he evidenced by various elements that he's bringing out in the text, they all show a universal judgment is in view as what he calls the end of the age. However, there is a relationship between the end of the age and the judgment of Israel. So without going into all of it, I'll say this. It is universal in driving the fact that these are the realities of the from when Jesus is speaking to the end of the age, but they're also local in showing that these same signs, being the signs of the coming of the kingdom, also pertain to AD 70, because the kingdom came as in its expansion, not in its consummation, in its expansion from Israel alone to all the nations. That's why you find in Matthew 22 that when the city is destroyed, what happened? The gospel doesn't stop, but rather he sends more messengers to go to everyone else. That is the expansion. However, in the end of the age, it's the conclusion of the entirety of the Great Commission, which is the consummation of the kingdom, the fullness of the kingdom. So my point is, it is both. But what drives the text is that it is a global, and then we have the same signs being used in a localized way, meaning it will have a partial, limited fulfillment in relationship to Israel. And that's why I would say that the text is both. It's local, but it is also universal, with the universal being used to depict the realities of the local on a local level. That's what I would say.
Okay, that's fair enough. So now we're going to open the floor. This is an open discussion time, guys. We could issue challenges, we could butt heads, we could shake hands, we can do whatever. So does anybody want to open the floor?
I have a question. When do full preterists say that the Messianic age begins? Does it begin in 80, 70 or before that?
What text are you alluding to?
Well, when do you say that the Messianic age begins? Because according to Matthew 24, you would say that it begins at the second coming, right?
Well, Arnton Goodrich has this definition of age. He actually includes the covenant headship of Moses, as well as the age of Jesus. So I would say when Jesus says heaven and earth shall pass away, you're basically tying the end of, in my opinion, the law. And in Matthew 24, he ties heaven and earth passing away, my words will remain. Notice he ties it in my opinion, with the destruction of the temple. So I would say that the age of Moses, and one thing with Martin, and I'm addressing your question, but
sure,
there's no escaping the time statements in the New Testament. In other words, Acts 17, Acts 24, he's about to come in judgment, right? Mm-hmm. Hebrews 1, in these last days, Acts 2 in these last days, 1 Corinthians, I think 9 or 10. And so I believe that in this grammar meant grammar, and they were in the last days of something. Now I would tie it. Martin talks about Daniel, and I agree. But Daniel's 70 weeks is coming to an end when the city and the sanctuary is destroyed. So that's why, in my opinion, those three questions are being asked. When is the sign of your coming? Which I already talked about, the Septuagint, where the Messiah is cut off, and he'll participate in that with the prince to come, which I see as Vespasian and Titus, and the end of the age. So if the end of the age, Daniel constantly talks about the end, right? But the end of what? To me, it's the end of the Mosaic temple cultus. And the reason is because in Daniel 7, right? Look at this. 70 weeks determined to finish the transgression, make an end to sin. So you have two ends: transgression, sin, reconciliation for iniquity. That's the end. That's another end. Bring in everlasting righteousness, right? So something's ceasing and now something new, this everlasting righteousness, sealing the end of vision of prophecy, and anoint the most holy. So I believe that especially the author of Matthew is tying Jesus' ministry, fulfilling the prophetic text of Daniel, and it is tied to the destruction of the temple. So in 70 AD, you could say the age of Moses passed, and the new heaven and earth in Revelation 21 after the judgment is when the full establishment of new heaven and earth comes into play, and all the former things passed away. The harlots judged, which I would take to be Jerusalem. And so, yeah, 70 AD would be that transition point from one age to another.
Anybody
So-
have anything else? How about you, Carmine? You got anything for us? And
I
then
guess
we just go around the room. We just throw stuff out. But go ahead, Carmine. What do
yeah,
you think?
yeah. I guess I would challenge the idea that you can't get around the time statements, because I've actually found that the time statements are some of the clinchers that there is an intended double reference, that's where we find Jesus himself, who is the greatest prophet in the context that we're talking about, is making these time statements using what appear to be puns or plays on words. And to me, that suggests there's some sort of duality going on there. And I think,
Can you give us real quick, Carmine? Can you give us an example, just so we know what you're talking about?
yeah, give me a second here. We can start. We're talking about Matthew 24, so let me just start with Matthew 24. It's not my favorite one because I think there are other ones that are more clear or more powerful up front. But there are other passages in Matthew 24 besides the one I'll talk about here. But let's start with verses 34 through 35. That's a common time statement that preterists put forth. Okay, truly I tell you, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away. So Jesus is using this phrase "pass away" several different times, right? 3 different times in the course of 2 verses. That's a little curious. Why would he do that? And it just happens that the play on words kind of hinges on that passing away. Now, the preterists pick up on the time statement that is intended. I'm not saying that it's not intended, okay? And that time statement hinges on this idea of passing away being just a gradual passing away of a generation over the course of time, right? But there's another way you can understand this passing away. If we look at verse 35, where it says, heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away. That if these passages can't actually be divided, okay, which I will entertain that they can't, okay, then that passage is saying heaven and earth will, if they're referring to the temple, okay, as many preterists believe, and that's the temple's destruction in 70 AD, then this passing away that it's speaking of is very forcible. It happens deliberately at all of a sudden, okay? And the same thing with Jesus's words, that they would be attacked and they would, people would be trying to force them out of existence, just like the temple here, okay? So if that is the same sense in which the previous verse is using pass away, then this is talking, it's also talking about the generation not forcibly passing away, not that Jesus is saying this generation will not be forced out of existence until all these things happen, saying that his coming is essential for that to happen, that will not happen until he comes. So from that perspective, it's not a time statement at all. It's a statement about the necessity of Christ's coming. So I'm saying it's both, okay, that Jesus intended this to be a play on words, or a pun, or as the scholars like to call it, paranomasia. Okay, so that's one example I would give you. There's another example. It's not a time statement, but it is a.
Can we deal with that just for a second, Carmine?
Yeah, go ahead.
The first one. And please, I don't want to hog the platform, but in just a quick response, the reality is there is a context. We would all agree that the context is found within the first few verses. If you do a comparative of Luke, Mark, and Matthew, we all know that Mark, I don't think, has any questions. Luke has maybe one. but it's all geared about the destruction of the temple. There's no denying that. And so you talked about the generation. And well, I would say first, the Greek Genea, whenever it's used in the Gospels, is always relative to the generation to whom they're speaking in that first century.
Which
there's
is
one.
Which
There's one.
what is a generation?
Hold on one second, brother. There's one text with the generations in Matthew, but even then, when you calculate the time frame, it comes out to about 42 years. So what I would say is, and this is a question I would have, if his return is predicated on these signs, and the full preterist would push back and say, well, all these signs took place. In other words, if you rightly interpret some of the apocalyptic text, but the famines and earthquakes, the false messiahs, wars, rumors of wars, etc., especially the temple's destruction, why would we look for another generation? That would be my question.
Well, I think
no, go ahead, Carmine.
Yeah. I think the response to that would be that there is a context, and the overall cultural context places a great deal of emphasis historically on plays on words. Okay, there are hundreds of examples of plays on words in the Old Testament. So as far as audience relevance goes, this audience probably should have been expecting Jesus, the greatest prophet of all, might employ some plays on words. Okay. Now, getting to the actual context, within the text here, you're talking about Genea, right? Well, Genea itself actually is one of the places where there is a significant play on words. In Matthew 23, verses 15, 33, and 36, there is a play on words between the term for the Greek Genea, Gehenna, and Genema. Look at those words in the Greek. The similarities are striking, particularly between Genea and Gehenna. And what Jesus is doing there is he's playing on the fact that this generation is wicked, and while they think that they are righteous, the righteous generation, that they are really sons of Gehenna. Okay. And he calls them a brood of vipers too, also playing off of this idea of Genea. Now, if you look at Genea too, even before we get to this context, right at the very beginning of Matthew and in the genealogy of Luke, and this kind of ties in with what you said about the approximate time frame of a generation being 42. What's interesting that Matthew actually he opens with 4 occurrences of the word Genea, and in the genealogy of Jesus, he happens to divide it. There happen to be 42 generations there, and he divides them into 3 groups of 14 being the double of 7. Clearly, there's some eschatological significance to that. Okay, and you can find the same sort of thing in Luke's genealogy of Jesus. And what's interesting, these are genealogies, which is rooted in the Greek word Genea, genealogy. That's what it's talking about. Okay, so I think and that's getting a little far from this context, and I think I could deal with everything you had said too about the events that did happen in 70 AD, and how could you apply those to another time period. I think that can be done. And you mentioned, you put an emphasis on the temple as being kind of maybe one of the most difficult things to work around, but I don't actually see that. I think that's actually quite easy to see as having a secondary fulfillment, and it doesn't require a physical temple either. So I said a lot. I don't want to, like you said, hug the platform or anything. Give anybody a chance to respond to what I've said.
Go ahead, guys.
Can I say something? I think it's important to ask ourselves really on that whole issue of the generation. Obviously, if that generation has to do with age period, or whether with people talking about it as 40 years, let's say now, we want to think about it contemporary. I come to you today, I said, oh, this generation, am I just speaking to people who are in America, or it also could be extended to people who are alive any part of the world at that time within a certain whatever period of age that they are. You get my point? So that my point is simply this. Whenever the word Genea is used, especially in the book of Matthew, notice Jesus consistently has a qualifier. Either will call them an adulterous generation, evil generation, and he connects it with the brood of vipers. In fact, in Mark chapter 8, verse 37 and 38, he says, an evil and adulterous generation, you are those who are ashamed of me and my words. And he said, whosoever is ashamed of me and my words, he is a part of what he calls an adulterous and perverse or evil generation. So the idea is Genea is essentially, as brother was talking about genealogy, it's about children who are born to someone. So you think about the genealogy of Adam and you notice that they are all those who are in Adam's image. The idea is they share a common what? Identity. So they are children of a particular father.
But
That's why
let me ask
Jesus.
you a question, Matt Martin.
Yes,
Let me ask you
yes.
a quick question because it's we're going way too deep. It's let's keep it kind of narrow focus here because I would just say, listen, if Jesus says all those things are going to happen in I believe the generation whom he's speaking. If you don't want to say that, what you'd have to say is that, in my opinion, that the Greek has to render the word generation in a plural. In other words, I tell you this generation, well, it's really multiple generations because we know that the temple is destroyed in 70 AD. So we know that we know the generation to whom that's tied to. But if you want to say, well, some of the other questions are tied to other generations, now you're kind of making a plural what it's not.
So what I'm trying to say is simply this, right? Because if you say this generation, and clearly it's not everyone in that generation who died, but rather it was rather people who were resisting Jesus Christ in
When
his
was the temple
ministry.
destroyed, Martin? Because we're going off on a tangent.
We all know it's 80-70,
So
right?
why wouldn't that be the generation Jesus was alluding to?
So notice, quick question. When I notice what I just told you, when I come to you and say this generation in our context today, it would include you, it would include me, and it will include anyone who is alive at this present period, wherever they are. Okay, so that what I'm getting at is this: the word has another limiting piece of information to it. When Jesus says this generation, he wasn't talking about people who will live and die within a certain period, but rather a character of a people. Because obviously, for instance, Matthew 16:27 and 28, it shows that there were some standing who did not die. Obviously, they belong to that generation, but they did not die in 80-70, right? So what I'm saying is the qualifier of this generation has to do with people who were resisting Jesus. Now, when you go to Mark chapter 8, 37, 39, Jesus said, it is when he comes with his holy angels that all these will be destroyed. And that is also what Matthew 16:27 says is the judgment with a reward for whoever, according to their works. And we see Matthew 25:31 to 46, that this coming with the holy angels is the judgment of all the nations. So what does that lead me to say? It leads me to say this: those in Jesus' time who resisted him, they are the same kind as those who are the second coming of Jesus, because they too are resisting the gospel. Because today, those who resist the gospel, they are the same kind as those who are resisting Jesus in that time. It's the same gospel. They are also the brood of the serpent, just like those of Jesus' time. So the idea is this: what will happen to those at the end when he comes with the holy angels? Guess what? That is exactly what happened in 80-70 to those when Jesus came through the Roman army. And that's why the idea of this generation, it's not about people living with a particular period of time, but broader, It is about the characteristic of a particular kind of people as those who belong to the devil. That's the idea. They were the opposing ones of Jesus. Even Matthew 23. Why are Israel being killed? They killed the prophets. They killed Jesus. So that this generation, it's not, for instance, Philippians even says a crooked and perverse generation. This has got nothing to do with Jews. In
Martin,
Philippians
you
chapter
read
2.
Matthew 16. Can
Yes.
you pull that up and read that for me? Matthew 16, 27.
When Moses talks about this generation, was he talking about Jesus's generation, or was he talking about his own generation? You know,
No, Jeff, restate the question, sir.
when Moses is the one who first said this generation, right? So
No,
if
what are you alluding
Moses
to?
was referring, who was Moses referring to? Was he referring to a generation that would occur over 1,000 years later? You know,
Yeah, I think the difference is, brother, is Jesus is saying certain things would take place in a particular generation, and the audience relevance, the
where
second
did
person
Jesus
plural
get that?
pronouns. He's
Where did
talking.
Jesus get that
What,
from? That was a prophecy by Moses, right?
go ahead. What prophecy are we talking about?
But Moses was
Deuteronomy
referring
30.
to the wicked people living in his time. Jesus was referring to the wicked people living in his time.
Okay, but you're missing the point, brother. If I asked you a question, I said, if all those constituent elements were fulfilled,
Yeah.
why would we look for another generation? In other words,
Okay.
you just made a prophecy,
Yeah,
right?
but Martin is right, though. It doesn't have. Was Caleb and Joshua, were they part of that wicked generation? No.
The context is the destruction of the temple, brother. So everything,
Well, that's what,
everything is connected to that.
when Moses brings it up, was Caleb and Joshua a part of that wicked generation? Moses said that this generation. So when Jesus does it, is he saying that his apostles are part of that wicked generation? Are
All right.
they a
So
part?
the question is, why can't it be the generation whom he's speaking to? Because
So
what you're saying is it
Are
hasn't happened.
the apostles the
It's going
wicked
to happen
part of
sometime
the
in the
wicked?
future.
Are the apostles? Are the apostles? As is Jesus himself a part of the wicked generation? If they
Uh,
are, then why weren't they destroyed?
got it. Thank you,
It's
Jeff.
a type.
Mark, go ahead and read that text, brother.
The Greek is very clear. It's a type of people, not a race, like the dispensationalists
Oh, that's
say.
kenos. Yeah, that's the Greek kenos.
Yeah,
I
that's
understand.
ridiculous. But it is a kind of people. Guess
so
what? The same word is used in Genesis, right, Martin? Because it's when you give birth to your own kind.
time. Yeah.
That's that same
But they are
word.
your genea. Your genea is your
Yeah,
brood. They are your offspring, right?
that it
So
means kind.
Yeah, but you're
so
saying it could be any generation.
no so
And
so
I'm saying is
uh,
he's tying
so
it
Michael.
as a framework, though, that you guys
So
are
Mr.
ignoring.
Michael, let me just say to
Yeah,
you to be clear in what I'm saying.
sure.
I am not, I've read Mark, I've read Luke, and it's very obvious. In Mark and Luke, the same signs of the coming of the Lord are used in relationship to what? 80, 70. But notice what I said at the beginning. Matthew 24 expands the scope of the prophecy to something called the end of the age. And throughout the text, he shows there are universal elements involved. For instance,
Okay,
Matthew
so let's
25.
deal with that real quick.
Excuse me, let me
Sure.
finish and I'll land here. I just want to be clear so you know my position. So what I'm saying is simply this. Because Matthew 24 has an expanded scope, the same prophecy, what is showing is this same prophecy, because they have similar realities, okay? Because they both pertain, whether it's 80, 70 you are talking about or the consummation, it's both called the coming of the Lord in his kingdom. One, it's the coming in his kingdom to expand it. The other one, it's the coming in his kingdom to bring its consummation. but the end comes with the same realities: judgment, separation, judgment of the wicked, reward of the righteous, life, eternal life, right? All these ideas. So at the end of the day, what I'm saying to you, when he says this generation, he is saying that you would agree with me, like Jeff is saying, it's not everybody living in that generation who died, but rather it is a specific kind of people who died. They were only Jews who are those rejected the gospel, who persecuted Jesus. They are the ones who died in AD 70, of which the judgment pertained to. It did not pertain to everybody without, right? It was specific. So the idea is it has to do with the character of the people who are present. But this character of the people talking about, it's not just a character relating to them. It relates to people everywhere in the period when the gospel goes, who will what? Persecute and reject the gospel. As a result, for instance, when the Bible said the generation of the righteous, it's not a reference to people in a 40-year period, but rather it's a reference to all righteous people who have lived throughout time. They are the generation of the righteous, but they are the genea of the righteous. So my
Okay, Martin,
point
I
is
got
this:
you, brother. Yep.
just as those who persecuted Jesus are this
I get you.
generation, referring to them as a people who hated Jesus and
Yeah,
persecuted him, guess what? That reality will also occur again. And according to that reality, what?
okay, brother,
All these things in their
I
fullness
got
will
you.
be fulfilled.
Yeah, you're
Exactly.
repeating
So
yourself, but it's
I
all
just
good.
wanted you to know. So I'm not denying that the prophecy has relevance to people in AD 70. That's what I want you to know. I don't deny that. I don't deny it. I'm not a dispensationalist or a futurist
So you're
or a
talking about
yeah, yeah.
multiple fulfillments then. So you, and
Yes, I am
so
talking
what
about
you're
the
saying is,
local
okay,
and yes,
you're
Why
saying,
why are you opposed to? Why would a Christian not be opposed to that?
okay, hold on. First, so you're conceding then that these constituent elements and what Jesus predicted and that generation experienced that destruction of the temple, wars, rumors of war. So it's been fulfilled. You're acknowledging it was fulfilled.
Yeah.
yes. It had a localized
Yes.
fulfillment to
Okay.
them, but it did not. For let me give you an example. If you ever read Isaiah 13,
So how many
you
times
will,
is this going to be
no.
fulfilled? That's what I was on.
Exactly. I'm glad you asked the question. And the text itself will tell us when we should
Well,
expect
tell
this
us,
other
yeah, show
fulfillment.
me in Matthew 24 this is going to happen all over again.
So let me give you an example. Matthew 24, the coming of the Lord in Matthew 24, verses 30, 28 to 32. Notice it is describing the coming when all those who pierce him will see him. Look at that. Let's look. Let me turn you to that. I'll show you something there. Verse 30. And when a sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky, then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds in the sky with great power. And he will send forth his angels with a great trumpet, and will gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of the sky to the other. Right? Notice the idea of him coming on the cloud, and the idea that those who are mourning are those who are the tribes of the earth. This is a reference to Zechariah chapter 12. But what is the context of Zechariah chapter 12? It is the coming of the Lord bringing judgment, not to Israel, brother. You know that. But it is the coming of the Lord bringing judgment to what? All the gathered nations who were against Israel. And that brings about the salvation of Israel. And then this same Zechariah 12 continues and goes into chapter 14. And there he talks about it as the coming of the Lord in the what? Holy ones. And there, what again is there? The same subject of the judgment against the nation. So that what I'm saying is this: the coming of the Lord in verse 28 to 30 in the cloud is the same coming of the Lord that you read in Matthew 25, 31 to 46, where he comes with the holy ones. But who are the ones being judged? At the gathering of the holy ones, coming of the Lord with the holy ones, the text clearly says all the nations, and it is also the separation judgment, right? On what basis are we going to relate this to Israel? The only way we can relate to this to Israel is if we say it is typological. That's the only way. But
Okay,
by
so
saying
brother,
that, we have affirmed that
let's
there
try to
is a
limit
greater
our
fulfillment.
question.
That's what that means.
So basically, you conceded to full preterism. You basically said it's been fulfilled. I don't have to
Notice
accept
what I
dual
said.
fulfillment.
Notice what I said. It has a typological fulfillment, meaning
That's fine. You
localized.
can say typological, but
Yeah.
you basically give
But
room.
notice,
Hold on, Jeff. Hold on, bro.
fulfillment, the
Wait,
fulfillment
wait.
is not.
I
you
understand.
gotta-
But
but
I
you
was
could-
talking and
You
you're
could
interrupting.
have
One second.
a typological fulfillment and an
Gentlemen, one at a
exegetical
time.
Guys,
fulfillment.
guys,
Yeah.
guys, let Mike respond, and then
Yeah,
we
brother,
can we
go
can
ahead.
continue the discussion. Go ahead, Mike.
Full passion. But I'm just saying, basically, you give room for the full preterist position.
Not really. No.
I don't hold on. I don't see anywhere in Matthew 24 where
You know why it doesn't leave room for the full preterist
brother
position?
Phelan just said not to interrupt, and you're interrupting. Have the fruit of the spirit.
Well,
You
I'm
make-
asking. I'm just
No,
saying.
but
Doesn't.
I have to land my plane, brother. That's only fair. Be cordial, respectful. Right?
You just misstated us.
Then you could address that in your rebuttal, brother.
Yeah, well, let Mike respond, and then we'll go back and forth again.
All right. So basically, I agree that this is tied to the end of the age, but there's only one 70-week narrative. You can't replay the last days. You can't replay the end of the age. In my mind, you can't replay the generation because everything Jesus said that would happen within the particular generation was fulfilled. So how do you replay everything was already fulfilled? That's on you guys. If you want to take it,
Yeah,
but then
yeah,
you
I
can't
get it.
knock
Because it's not a
the full
complete
preterist
fulfillment.
for believing.
It is a fulfillment, yes. It is a fulfillment, but it's not a complete fulfillment. Guess what? Hey, let's put it this way. When Israel came back from Babylon, was that a fulfillment of Israel coming back into the land? Were they being restored to the land? Would you
Yes.
call that the fulfillment of all those prophecies? Would you
Yes.
call that? You would say that was the fulfillment of all those prophecies when they came back. Did all of them come back? Did all of them come back?
No. Yeah, during the Persian Empire, whoever was meant to come back, whoever wanted to come back, returned.
Was that the fulfillment?
That was the fulfillment. Yeah, you're not going to space that. There's no exiles living in the first century.
That's why you don't understand what fulfillment's about, because you can have partial fulfillments, but if that was a fulfillment, then you wouldn't have Messiah. You wouldn't have had a Messiah coming.
Yeah, no, I don't believe that. I think Jeremiah 18, God can change his plan based on the conditions and actions of his people.
God doesn't change his plan.
No.
His plan is from the beginning.
But it was fulfilled. I'm saying it was fulfilled. You can read that in Ezra and Nehemiah. There were a remnant that returned from both houses.
They were fulfilled in part. They were
so,
fulfilled
brother,
in
let me
part.
give, for instance, the text in Jeremiah and Deuteronomy. They said that the restoration will occur through the new covenant. The new covenant was not made in 539 BC. And it also says that
Well,
there
I
will
disagree.
Oh, I could show you. Jeremiah 31 is connected
Okay,
to the
because
restoration.
I'm not going to I have a whole breakdown on Jeremiah 31 and how it fits with Jeremiah.
Is Jeremiah talking about
Jeremiah
the new covenant?
Yeah, but we're
Ezekiel
talking
also
about
said,
the Olivet discourse with your Messiah, who's making claims. And C.S. Lewis said it's the most embarrassing text because he believed that if you don't take it for what it says, it's a false prophecy. And that's why Muslims and atheists push back against Christians.
Well,
What you're saying is 2,000 years later, God hasn't fulfilled his promise. And to me, that Tristan is right. That would amount to a false apocalyptic movement.
Are you saying Zerubbabel's temple was the promised temple that would be built? You're saying when they came back into the land and when
I'm not chasing the rabbits, bro. I'm not dealing with Jeremiah.
No,
it's the
you
point
don't,
about the
because you don't understand fulfillment.
Of
eschatology. Let's say it. I don't see Matthew 24 any partial fulfillment. Where's the partial fulfillment in Matthew 24?
So let me ask you a question. Is Matthew 24 connected to Matthew 25? Is it the same coming in Matthew 25 as there is in Matthew 24? That's my question to you.
Yeah, of course. There's not multiple
so
comings,
that's so
multiple
good.
gatherings, multiple rewards. That's why. Hold on, I wanted to read Matthew 16 because.
Yeah, I will come back to that. You answered the question. You
Well,
said
I'm
they
just
are,
saying.
but
I'll
let me.
read it real quick. Go ahead. You go ahead. You
Okay,
go ahead.
because what I'm asking is, if you come then to Matthew 25:31, it said he will gather all the nations and he will separate them as sheep and the goats, and then they receive the eternal kingdom. And then this will also be the time of the eternal judgment, and Satan himself will be judged. Now, let me ask you a question. How were all nations gathered and there was a separation? People notice the text said all nations were gathered, and it is clearly in the context a gathering of all those who belong to Jesus from all nations as a sheep, and those who they don't belong to Jesus as enemies, also from all nations. But AD 70 was simply about one nation. The judgment was about one nation. Are you going to deny that? It wasn't
No,
only
I don't
Israel
see
that was judged.
Yeah, that's why I pointed to Acts 17. You can point to Romans 2.
No, but we have
There
to
was
also
there
do
was
the things
a
in their
universal judgment.
context.
There was a universal judgment because it's fulfilling Daniel chapter 7. So the
So
transference of the kingdom is taking over the four beasts. They didn't rule just Jerusalem.
So
The
they
four
were cast into the lake of fire.
the four beasts ruled over the known world. So when Christ is receiving his the kingdom, like in Revelation 11, the kingdom that belonged to God and the Son was not just the kingdom of Israel, it's the kingdom of the world, and it's fulfilling Daniel 7, which is given to all nations, all peoples, all languages. And to me,
So-
the transition was in 70 AD to that kingdom was transferred in 70 AD. Matthew 21, stripping the nation and kingdom from Israel. And I believe the Romans, Julio-Claudian dynasty, they fell, and that was stripping Rome as well. But go ahead, Colin.
I'm just trying to understand your perspective, Michael. So you're saying that are you saying it's the church, basically true Israel, that replaced the kingdoms of the earth, that the church itself became the replacement for the kingdoms that ruled the world? Is that your point?
Well, I would say clearly the transition took place in my mind in 70 AD, which is to say, when you look at Matthew 24-25, where they're receiving the inheritance, I believe that's tied to Daniel. After the judgment, which I tied to 70 AD, Matthew 21 is clearly against that religious and political system where it says the kingdom will take it from you and given it to a people. I believe that was 70 AD. Jesus says in Revelation 21, I'm coming quickly, my reward is with me. I wanted to point to Matthew 16 because he said he's about to come and then give the reward. So yeah, I see that transition and that transference of covenant control in 70 AD from the fourth beast of iron and clay. So I see that as Roman Israel. So I believe the civil wars pointed to Christ's shaking of the heavens and earth, not just of Israel, but of those powers in which, 70 AD, by the time the Julio-Claudian dynasty fell, that's the Caesar gods. And by the time Herod, the dynasty of Herod fell, and the high priest dynasty of Annas, those religious and political systems, that judgment represented Christ stripping them of their power, giving it to the saints. So in 70 AD, the saints have the government of God, the covenant control. In Revelation chapter 2, they'll rule the nations with a rod of iron. It says after the end. So I would say they judged Israel from 30 in that 66 to 70, but in 70 now they rule. The mandate to rule is given to the saints.
Okay. Thanks.
So
Thanks, Michael, for clarifying that.
when did the beast come up out of the abyss? I mean, these are all relevant questions, though, because we never get answers to them from the full preterists. When does the beast come up from out of the
Well,
abyss?
there's two beasts, right? Revelation 13, sea beast, land beast. Listen, again, you're dealing with time statements. Those things are soon and quickly to take place. So
Brother, we cannot talk about this time statement with eschatology. There are
you can't ignore it
a lot
either.
of parts,
You
right?
can't ignore it either.
Let's deal
Just pointing it out.
exegetically with various texts
You
And
can't
then let's
ignore.
see what it teaches. I'm not
Okay,
saying we should
so
ignore
I
things,
tie
because they
the
are not
beast
everything.
to
Just so
Rome.
you know, Michael, I agree with you in a lot of what you're saying here.
Yeah.
What you're saying, we need more justification than what I think has been provided to say that there is more to be fulfilled. Okay, I would not agree with Martin and Jeff this far is to say that what they've presented so far is sufficient to see secondary fulfillment. Okay.
Well, I can go
Um,
there if you want me to, but I sent you guys all my paper. But here's the thing: no one gives good definitions on full preterism. The restoration. When does it begin? When does
Uh,
the restoration
be more
begin?
specific, brother. What do you mean restorate?
You
Explain it
should
to me.
know the answer to that. When does the restoration begin?
Well, during
Restoration.
the conversation, I think that I've made it clear that the transition and the pivot point from the old to the new was after the judgment, and that's the transition to the restoration. The
After
never,
the judgment, the restoration begins. That's what you're
yeah,
saying.
yeah.
So the restoration was complete in 70 AD.
Well, that's why I asked you to clarify. Restorate. What do you mean restoration? What does it look like to you? What
They're
scripture are
all,
you
these
referring
are
to?
all these are all the restoration passages, right?
Great. Show me them. What are you
Okay.
appealing to?
So Don would say that the restoration began with John the Baptist, right?
Brother, when you say restoration, I'm asking you to clarify what do you mean by restoration? What text are you appealing to?
I'm appealing to all the restoration passages in the Old Testament, that Isaiah 9, Isaiah 7, Isaiah
Okay,
6,
okay. So yeah, Mark chapter
49, 42, 40,
yeah. So Mark chapter
21.
he cleared the kingdom has come. That's part of the good news package, and that's an allusion to Daniel. So in the time of those kings, God would raise up a kingdom, which He did in the first century, at the time of the Julio-Claudian dynasty and the Herod and Annas dynasties of Israel. And God is raising up a kingdom, and from 30 to 70 AD, there's an Exodus period in which He is gathering the wheat and tares. He is going over these motifs of building a spiritual temple, going from childhood to adulthood, and the
So
birth.
why do you have the restoration text being fulfilled before 70 AD then?
Brother, so I'm explaining my idea of the rising up of the coming of the kingdom. So if
Yeah.
you think that that's the restoration, yeah, that's the beginning, right?
Yeah.
Right? Isn't that the beginning of the restoration when the kingdom is
When
come
Jesus
home?
was born, that was the beginning of the fullness of the messianic age.
Wait, say that again.
When Jesus was born,
When he was
it
born.
was the fullness of time.
Uh-huh.
That was the beginning of the messianic age.
Sure, I don't disagree with that. Of course.
You do disagree with
Well,
that.
John the Baptist,
That's not
you could
what
say
Don
John the
believes.
Baptist is preaching first in repentance, but it's
See,
all tied together.
you can't have, but then what happens after the restoration is complete in 70 AD? Why is the
Well,
gospel still being preached? Do you know Isaiah 49 is a restoration text, right?
yeah, that's quoted in the New Testament several times.
What is the day of the Lord's favor then?
Well, the day of the Lord's favor and the sort of fulfillment of the Jubilees is all tied to the Messianic ministry, which began, of course, in His life, His death, His ascension, His bringing His enemies under His feet. And that ministry, I believe, culminated in 70 AD. But obviously,
It ended in 70 AD?
of course not. He rules.
Well, Isaiah 49 is quoted in 2 Corinthians 6:2, right?
So that was being fulfilled, and Paul's making that clear. In Luke chapter 2, it's being quoted as well. Salvation is being brought to the Jews and to the nations. That the gospel was preached to the whole world in fulfillment of Matthew 24. So I don't disagree with you.
So you're saying the restoration was complete, and then you have Isaiah. 2 Corinthians 5 is the ministry of reconciliation. Would you agree that reconciliation is the same as restoration?
It's all connected. Redemption, reconciliation, salvation. It was all like present tense
Because
and moving forward
what does
into the
Paul
future.
what does Paul contrast the ministry of reconciliation with? The ministry of death, right?
The covenant of Moses. That's how I see it.
So
2 Corinthians chapter 3. The administration of death was tied to the old covenant age, the old covenant system.
if the ministry of reconciliation was going on, why did it stop in 70 AD?
Well, if death is the last enemy, and for the full preterist is obviously tied
Well,
to
that
the
means
Moses.
the gospel. So we don't preach the gospel anymore. We're not ambassadors for Christ anymore, right?
Okay, so let me respond, brother. There's an exodus taking place for a specific generation. They have the opportunity over those 40 years to make a choice, right? This is the Messiah's words. If you don't heed the Messiah, you'll be cut off. But that came and went, and it doesn't mean the gospel is not for other generations. In other words, the gospel is life and immortality. That is an age. That is hold on, that's a dispensation. That's a new heaven and earth. That's a when Peter says a new heaven and earth where righteousness dwells, or where Daniel talks about after the city and the sanctuary are destroyed, it's bringing in everlasting righteousness.
So a generation is a time period, but an age is not a time period.
No, I'm saying Christ is the gospel, the tree of life. That life and immortality is everlasting, according to Revelation 14. So I'm saying for that generation, it closed. Revelation 20, when it says heaven and earth fled, no one can come into it. So what I believe that's representing is the old covenant age. There was a transition point, two covenants or at the same time, but eventually there's a cutoff period for that generation. That was 70 AD. Heaven and earth fled, and now there's a new heaven and earth reality. That is a new covenantal world. Hebrews 2 talks about the world to come. That's oikomeni. That's a new earth. And so, yeah, I believe in this age, this present age, where the tree of life is no tree of the knowledge of good and evil, life and immortality, the word of life, and healing leaves of the tree of life is extended, and the nations can come into the city. So that life and immortality ceased for that generation, but it doesn't cease for future generations.
In Matthew 22, you have another ending after the city is destroyed.
Sally,
Yeah, let's look at it.
Yes, let's look at it.
Because they have to come. 22. Do they not have to come?
And that ending is also a judgment ending. Okay, that ending is a judgment. Let's look at it.
Hold it up.
Yeah, Matthew 22. Because I want to say that the idea that the preaching of the gospel has completed the Great Commission in AD 70, basically it undermines what the proclamation after the city is destroyed. It makes it a part of something that we don't even know anything about. Because if Acts 1, it says you preach from Jerusalem, Judea, and then to the ends of the world, that phrase, the ends of the world, it's the reason why you have in Psalm 98, the new song is being sung from the ends of the earth, because the gospel, which brings salvation and justification, which is the idea that people now have God's righteousness, comes about. So that I think it makes sense to say that the preaching of the gospel was completed for Israel in that time, but it did not complete the entirety of the Great Commission, which was given in Matthew 28, which same commission is what you have in Acts 1:8 and Luke 24, and that is what you see in Isaiah 64, Isaiah 61, 42, 49, all these places. It's the same ministry of the anointed servant. So I don't think it's a different type of preaching, but it's the same fulfillment of proclamation, which is the restoration, because after all, the restoration is about salvation and people receiving the Holy Spirit. And it didn't just end in AD 70, it happens still today. So one have to properly be able to say that. Right. And what I'm getting at is, but when Jesus in Matthew 28, 18, 20 speaks, he says, the completion of the gospel going to all the nations,
That wasn't fulfilled. Paul said it was fulfilled.
Exactly. So what does Paul mean when he said all it was fulfilled? Paul was not saying that all the preaching in that text is fulfilled. Rather, what he's simply saying is, by this, it was saying that The gospel will go to both Jew and Gentile. So according to what was said, it is happening, because after all, when Paul said that, he didn't stop preaching the gospel. He still went ahead and he was still preaching to other people, fulfilling what? The same prophecy about preach the gospel to other nations. So Paul never meant that the Great Commission was completed in his time. No, what he was saying is that the preaching was to be for both Jew and Gentile, and that is representational. But he's not saying it is exhaustive in his time. That's why we today still have a Great Commission and we have a gospel. And that commission on which we preach is the same commission. Or else the church today have no basis for preaching the gospel. If you're saying Matthew 28 is fulfilled, 18 to 20.
Brother, I laid out the premise why that it is the case. So you didn't argue.
But I'm also laying out another premise where the text we are going to look at in Luke 24, in Matthew 22 shows is the same kingdom that is being offered, whether it was to the Jews or afterwards, which is the same preaching of the gospel.
But the account of Matthew 24 is tied to a specific.
We're going to Matthew 22. Let's go read that.
Yeah, that's fine. I understand. We'll pull it up.
Let's go.
But I'm saying the narrative of Matthew 24, it's contextually tied to the end of the destruction of the city and the sanctuary. So yes, the gospel was preached, and that would be fulfilled in that generation. Paul says it was fulfilled. I'm not saying he stopped preaching, but
you guys say it's preached in all the world, so it doesn't need to be preached anymore if it's already
exactly. If
in all
done,
the world.
and it's done. Just
I
like
just said
there's
a specific narrative for that generation. The tares and the wheat are being separated. There's a judgment to come. Yeah, I talked about the cutoff for a particular generation, but I established the premise that in the age, the new world, the new heaven and earth, that life and immortality, the tree of life, the water of life, the healing leaves, it all paints a picture as it doesn't cease. It ceased for them. The harlot was judged in 70 AD. The cutoff for those in Moses, they had to come out. If they didn't come out, it's like Galatians 4, 2 covenants, right? It says the one will be burned and not participate in the inheritance. So that was fulfilled. That doesn't mean the gospel, which is everlasting in Revelation 14, has a particular end, because that would mean Jesus is an end, or his priestly mediation ends, or God is life. So in life and immortality, Christ established that new heaven and earth and new age. It doesn't pass away.
Brother, there is a difference between saying the blessings of the gospel are eternal and saying the preaching will go on forever. Those are not the same things.
Well, why can't you preach the gospel today, post-7?
I'll tell you why. Exactly in Matthew 22, it tells us that the preaching will go on until the hall is filled.
Okay, let's go to the
text. That in the text. Let's go in there. Let's go there. Yeah.
And you can't preach the gospel after everything's already been restored.
Well, that sounds silly. You're in the restoration. It's like, for example, if Moses and the Israelites, they had an exodus, they had a salvation redemptive event, and they didn't look to that account or that story of the future generations. They participated in that gospel or that salvation. And just like all generations of Israelites, they participated in that covenantal salvation. So if I don't participate in that exodus or that salvation of the first century, it doesn't mean that what that established and what that built passes away. Revelation 21 and 22 is clear.
Passing away. There's a difference between, again, the difference is the kingdom is established, is brought by Christ. Okay, we get that. But coming into the kingdom, okay, is it an eternal reality? Because I don't want to get into Matthew 20, Revelation 21. You've been using that text so much, and I don't want to get into it. But
yeah, let's ignore
it. If you want to talk about people coming into the kingdom, then guess what? The whole concept of the lake of fire, all right? You already are making that lake of fire not as a place of eternal judgment anymore. Notice the text is clear.
I'm happy with that, by the way.
Whoever was cast into the lake of fire, there is no opportunity for salvation. It was a final judgment. Nobody in the text is said to
That's
come from
your
the lake of fire
interpretation of Revelation
into.
21,
I
22.
mean, we could get there. We could get there. But for now, my assertion is
Your
that the
name is
gospel
blotted out of the book of life.
If there's no tree of the knowledge of good and evil, there's no Hades, you have an opportunity to accept the life of God through Christ. Christ
I'm talking
established his
about the
foundation.
lake of fire.
You don't get
I'm
up
not
out of
talking
the
lake
about
of fire.
Hades.
Because there's no lake of fire, that means the life of God and faith experiencing God through Christ and immortality is passed away on what basis? Why are
I'm
you connecting the
saying
lake of fire?
when you go into the lake of fire, we never see, for instance, when the tares are gathered into the everlasting fire, it is said to be an everlasting punishment for them. That's why the goats are said to experience everlasting punishment. That which is everlasting punishment, it's
So
everlasting
you
in
believe
nature.
in eternal conscious torment? Is that what you're saying?
Oh,
Yes.
yes, I believe
Oh,
in
Okay, God
eternal
bless you guys.
punishment of sin. I'm not saying I believe in
No, I don't
someone
do
being in a physical fire eternally. Those are two different things. But I believe in eternal punishment for sin.
Okay, great. I don't believe that. So, but
Okay.
that's off the topic. So,
Yeah,
good.
so let's come back to Matthew 22. Matthew 22. My assertion is that the preaching of the gospel is completed when the hall is filled. So it has an end. It's not eternal. So let's look at the text. Matthew 22 verses we could particularly read from we could read the whole thing to after verse 13. That's where Jesus spoke to them in parables. The kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who gave a wedding feast for his son. And he sent out the slaves to call those who had been invited to the wedding feast, and they were unwilling to come. Again, he sent out other slaves, saying, tell those who have been invited, behold, I have prepared my dinner. My oxen and my fighting livestock are all butchered, and everything is ready. Come to the wedding feast. But they paid no attention and went their way, one to his own farm, another to his business. And the rest seized the slaves and mistreated them and killed them. But the king was enraged, and he sent his armies and destroyed those murderers and set their city on fire. Verse 8, then, that is after that fact, he sent to his slaves. He sent his slaves. Then he said to his slaves, the wedding is ready, but those who were invited were not worthy. Go, therefore, to the main highways, and as many as you find, invite to the wedding feast. Those slaves went out into the streets and gathered together all they found, both good and evil, and the wedding hall was filled with dinner guests. But when the king came in to look over the dinner guests, he saw a man who was not dressed in wedding clothes, and he said to him, friend, how did you come in here without wedding clothes? And the man was speechless. Then the king said to the servants, bind him hand and foot and throw him into the outer darkness. In that place, there'll be weeping and gnashing of teeth, for many are called, but few are chosen. So according to the account, there is a first sending to those who were invited. They rejected, they beat up those who were sent to them. And then the king said, you did this to my slaves, I'm going to send my armies. And we all agree that is AD 70 when Israel was judged because they rejected Christ and all the prophets of old which were sent to them. And then we are told that same invitation to the same event called the wedding supper. And the wedding supper is the kingdom. Do we agree or not? The wedding supper is the kingdom. So the invitation is the invitation to come into the kingdom, to
And it goes
partake
to the
of the kingdom.
highways and the byways, which is the Gentiles.
Okay, so did you land your plane, or are you good?
I'm sorry?
I mean, did you finish your discourse?
Oh, yeah. So I'm saying, the text says they went and they invite, those slaves went out and gathered, and they found, and the wedding hall was filled with dinner guests. That means until the wedding hall was filled, guess what? The invitation was going on. And notice when the wedding hall was filled, that's when the one who said, I'm sending you came, which was the Father himself. And what he does is now, before the wedding supper events, he is making sure that all those at the hall are only those who have the wedding garment. And therefore, this parable relates very well to the parable of the fishes, where you have the good and evil who are gathered and put into who are collected in the net. That's the idea there. And so what you have now is the separation of the good from the evil, who are those who have the wedding garment and those who did not have the wedding garment. But this occurred when the wedding hall was filled. The wedding hall was filled by the invitation.
Okay,
The
I got
invitation
you.
is
I got
what
you.
exactly. So the two questions I'll have for you is, what is this judgment of separation, which was way after AD 70 in the text?
Oh, I understand.
And the wedding supper is clearly in this text being shown to be at the end of when this judgment, this second judgment, comes to pass.
I understand.
And we don't see any invitation going on after, because the hall has been filled.
Martin,
and the idea.
Yes, I understand, brother.
Yes, good. So the gospel is not forever.
I don't agree with your reading of the text, because I see it as recapitulation. This is not a separate narrative. Yes, I see that as the Gentiles, and that's what Acts 10 is all about. The introduction to the gospel to others. He's going to the highways, byways, to the nations, because there's only one wedding supper, brother.
So
that happened after the
destruction of the
Revelation
city.
18:19. And so the invitation of the gospel, the preaching of the gospel, go out to all nations within the generation that Jesus spoke.
But notice, it's after AD 70.
No, I don't accept you. I see that as Semitic parallelism.
No, you can't. This text is giving a narrative. It said, I
disagree with your reading of the text.
But it's not about you disagreeing. The text is saying the judgment came,
no,
and then he sent them to go out.
He's retelling the story again. That's what Jews do.
No, it's not. It doesn't make sense, brother.
Where's the destruction of the city after the destruction of the city?
No, brother, right? I'm reading it.
Matthew 22 doesn't talk about
reading it like you guys are. So
Matthew 22 does not say there's two destructions of the city. The book of Revelation is recapitulation.
You guys are saying that's going to happen again in the future, 2,000 years later.
There is another judgment in the text.
Another Antichrist, another end of the age.
Guys, let Mike answer. I know Martin, you went and you gave your view of Matthew 22. Let's let Mike answer, and we'll let him answer, and then we'll bounce it back to Carmine because he hasn't spoken in a while.
Sure.
Yeah. So this is kind of an eisegetical tool that you're using because you can't deal with what Matthew 24 actually says.
Eisegetical. Give me a break.
Okay, but you're using one text that I think you're misreading it.
You don't have to stay with one text.
But I'm saying it all fits within a particular framework. There's one wedding supper, right? That's Revelation 18:19 after the judgment. The gospel is being preached to all the nations, first to the Jew. Well, they're rejecting it. Fits perfectly, because guess what happened? He went to the highways and byways to the nations.
That's the nations. That's the nations.
That was fulfilled.
Huh? That was the nations, though. That wasn't Israel.
It's going to happen all over again. That's all. That's fine.
No. The highways and byways are not the same thing as Israel. They're not the same thing as the city.
I just said to the Jew first and to Israel. They rejected it. Remember Romans, there was a hardened of Israel. God would call the Gentiles, so that's going to the highways and byways, just like east to the west when he says Abraham, those are the kingdom.
Who do you think highways and byways are?
Well, outside of that Israel community, right? The people who rejected the gospel. So he's going down to the nations.
Like Spain and Africa. What countries are included in the highways and byways?
Well, it was to all nations, so the known world, brother.
Our known world or their known world?
They're no more. Yeah.
So there is no gospel preaching after, because if it's a recapitulation, then there is no further gospel preaching.
I've already addressed that. So, Carmine, go ahead, brother, if you have something to say. That's all. I've addressed my concept of post 70 AD. The new heaven and earth, the new world, the new covenant. What was growing old and obsolete was soon to vanish away. I believe the new covenant wasn't fully established and installed until 70 AD. So how could the new covenant, which was in transition and being built up and being established, but wasn't fully established till 70 AD? What, the new covenant passed away?
That's not true. That is not true. You don't understand.
What is not true?
You don't understand Hebrews 9. You don't understand Hebrews 10.
Well, now you're off on a tangent.
Yeah, I know.
So, brother, let me ask you a
What
question.
don't I
don't
understand
understand
about
the
it?
new covenant.
What don't I understand about it?
Hebrews 8:13. You don't understand.
So tell me what I'm getting wrong there.
Do you believe that the temple was that it's talking about the temple still standing at that time?
I believe that was written around 66 AD.
Well, that's talking about Jeremiah. I'm sorry. You're talking about, when do you think the covenant, the old covenant, began to pass away? When did it become old and begin to pass away?
Obviously, if it's written around 66, it was in the process of passing away. So it
Guess
hadn't.
what? Guess what? It says, in speaking, in calling the covenant new, he made the first one old, right?
Okay, but there was a transition.
Who was the one who called it new?
Yeah, I understand the ratification and the probate period of the new covenant being introduced through Christ, but it wasn't fully established. The new heavens and earth, which I represent as a new covenant.
Who is he quoting from? Who is Hebrews quoting from?
Enlighten me, brother.
Who is Hebrews quoting from?
I said, enlighten me. I want you to tell me.
Jeremiah.
Are you talking about Hebrews 8? Yes, I know Hebrews 8. Yeah, he's quoting Jeremiah.
Yeah. So who was the one that called the covenant new, making the old one old?
Okay, yeah, Jeremiah 31 to 34, right? Okay.
Do you understand?
I'm saying, brother, in Galatians 4, obviously the old covenant had passed away fully because Paul goes into the dichotomy. Those of the old covenant persecuting those of the new covenant. So you can't have a battle between the two if it's just the new covenant. And he says those would be burned and destroyed, and then they receive their inheritance, which is the full establishment.
The new covenant came into existence at the cross, and the old covenant passed away at the cross.
Okay, so I don't accept that now.
Huh?
How is that possible, brother? If Daniel 9 is tying,
because Hebrews tells us.
No, okay, well, I don't.
Where do you want to go? Where do you want to go? Hebrews 9, 10, 8.
Okay, so if Hebrews says what is growing old and becoming obsolete hasn't vanished away, and Corinthians talks about the glory of the old covenant is fading, and so you ultimately receive the fullness of the glory of the covenant.
Guess when it was growing old? It was growing old already in Jeremiah's time.
Fine.
It was wearing out.
That's not my argument.
Obsolete.
When was it fully? When was the old covenant age fully adjudicated? This way, all the former things can pass away because the judgment is tied to.
You're refusing to look at Hebrews. The texts show what happened in Ephesians 2 and Colossians 2 refer to the old covenant being destroyed or abolished or put to death at the cross.
Yeah, I believe that was inaugurated. The kingdom is being ushered in, but hadn't yet fully.
But the old covenant was abolished, put to death, nailed to the cross.
Yeah, it had broken through the darkness, but you cannot say based on a cumulative picture.
Where is the word broken through the darkness?
Because it was the point of the corporate idea of this resurrection, which is tied.
It says it was nailed to the cross.
So it was being worked out. Remember, Hebrews says Christ has been given power over all his enemies. We don't see that, but we see, he's lower.
Where does it say that it was being worked out?
Well, that's the idea.
There's no overlap between the covenants.
All the motifs, like from the whole Exodus period, going from childhood to adulthood, or going from the birth pains to actually giving birth, or the idea of the Exodus, the promised land. What was the promised land they were looking for, right? I'm just saying the new heavens and earth is the idea that when the old constituent elements of the judgment, that's tied to the old covenant. The resurrection is tied to the old covenant. The old covenant system hadn't yet been dissolved. So that's what Revelation 20 says, that the heavens and earth after the judgment finally fled. So if heavens and earth in Matthew 5, Matthew 24 is tied to the passing of heavens and earth, then the heavens and earth at that age hadn't yet passed away. And if death, if death is tied to the covenant, which in 1 Corinthians 15, it's tied to the law, well, that means that death wasn't fully adjudicated, because Paul is saying that that enemy hadn't yet been fully defeated.
So let me ask you a question. You just made a point at making at least it sounded like you are saying death, okay, passed away in 80s, 70s. That's what you were saying, right? Basically, death was swallowed up in 80s, 70s. That's what
the
you were
administration
saying.
of death. Yes, the old covenant.
No, and I'm very specific. I'm not talking about the administration of death. You made mention of 1 Corinthians 15. Death is swallowed up in victory. You said that is in 80, 70, right?
Yes.
Is that what you're saying? Okay. You agree with me? That also means the abolition of all the enemies has occurred, correct?
Yep.
Cool. Let me ask you a question. Who are all the enemies of Christ that we are told from the book of Psalm 110 that he was to rule until all his enemies are abolished, with death as the last enemy? And when we go to the book of Revelation, chapter 20, what we see is when death is abolished as the last enemy, let me mention who else have been abolished up until that time. You have the beast. You have all the nations who were gathered against Christ's kingdom, meaning you have all the kings of the earth who are the kings of the gathered nations. They are not Roman kings. They are kings of all the gathered nations. It's not just Israel. The text is clear. They're kings of the 10 horns. They are all the nations. Now, let me ask you, if it said all the enemies of Christ have been abolished, that would say that after that period, if death is the last enemy, that means you cannot have any enemy after the abolition of all the enemies of Christ. Notice the word is all. Now, let me ask you today, do you agree with that? You cannot have any enemy after the abolition of all the enemies of Christ.
Yeah, Christ is.
So today, let me ask you, are the kings of the earth raging against Christ's kingdom?
No, brother.
No?
Oh my God.
Wait.
The kingdoms of the earth
that they are raging against. So let's look at Acts chapter 4. When Peter quotes Psalm 2, he explains the rage of the nation against Christ first, as that which has to do with the opposition against Christ. And secondly, he said it was opposition against them as the preachers of the gospel. And when we come to Revelation, that rage of the nations that bring about the rod, it is spoken of as all the gathered nations. That means it's a universal.
You just quoted Acts.
So,
you just quoted Acts 4.
I'm asking you.
So let me answer.
The opposition to Christ and His kingdom. Are you saying today there are no kings who oppose the rule of Christ and the gospel and the church?
I got your question.
Are you saying there is none?
Now this is the fifth time, brother Martin. I got you, brother. I got you.
Yeah, but because because it's alarming. Because
Martin,
himself,
I understand the question.
Okay, now bring your answer.
Yes, sir. Yeah.
Okay, so now tell me, are there any enemies today? And if there are, how can all the enemies of Christ be abolished?
Do you know another language? Maybe you can say it in Spanish.
I'm asking my question again. So I heard clear about your answer. Okay,
yes.
Good. Go ahead.
Answer, Martin. Let him answer.
Yes. So there are particular enemies, right? So in Luke chapter 1, he talks about this, right? Where he says, he's quoting, if I can pull it up real quick, Luke 1:68 from 70. Salvation from our enemies and the hand of all who hate us, right? So what I would say is there's a context and there's a narrative. There are particular enemies involved. There's a particular prophecy involved with Daniel. So this is dealing with the fourth beast, not a fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth beast. So if my position is that the kingdom arose during the time of the kings of both the Iron of Rome and Israel, right, the clay, then those are the enemies, right, that Christ is going to deal with, because they had the right to government over the earth, right? And so I'm saying if the transition to 70 AD, where now that authority has been given to Christ and the saints, well, they have the mandate. Well, first of all, it's a kind of copying off the or Genesis. So the church has the mandate to be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth. But covenant control and the government is placed with Christ and the saints. The enemies of that time were absolutely defeated. If we have enemies today, that's the role of the church, to make the manifold wisdom of God and Christ known to the world, to be a salt and light of the earth. And we're actually the body of Christ, who's meant to control the earth, rule the nations with a rod of iron. In part, we're not doing it because we hold in dispensational and futurism. We don't believe the kingdom right.
Mike, can I
I'll
ask
see the enemies that the New Testament is dealing with.
Hey,
We're
Mike.
done.
So,
brother,
I'm trying to clarify something, but Mike, hold on. Hold on, Martin.
And real quick, I'm not going to speak real quick because I want Carmine to get involved.
Yeah.
Because this is a
brother,
Mike show.
You
So
want
we
to
ask
say
a question,
something, Carmine?
but I'm going to step back for a second. I'll answer your question, but let Carmine get some time as well.
I just have a lot of unanswered questions with full preterism because.
So let's direct message, and we'll spend some personal time together. Have some tea, and we'll go over a lot of verses. Okay.
Yeah, you dismiss.
All right.
You dismiss. You can't answer.
Carmine, go ahead, man. Speak your piece or whatever, and then we're gonna start wrapping up because we're at the 1 hour and 36-minute mark. So we'll do some quick closing statements. But go ahead, Carmine.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, so I just want to say, after what you all just experienced right there, that's why people like me went down the route of skepticism. Okay, because you're all guilty of the same thing. Okay, Martin and Jeff are seeing things in picking and choosing what things they want to see as spiritual, which things they want to see as literal. Michael is choosing, things in a little bit different combination. How do you prove who is wrong? And that's why I don't waste any time arguing about those specific types of things, because it's too easy to weasel your way out of them. And I think that's something Christians in general are guilty of. So I guess since we're talking about, full preterism, to me, the reason I, kind of went down the route I did with this dual fulfillment, seeking evidence of that, was because after being convinced that the Bible had really taught full preterism in some sense, and that the New Testament authors were trying to propose or prove that all prophecy had been fulfilled, I don't know why preterists actually believe the Bible anymore after making that discovery. Because when I made that realization, I was like, they just made it up. Okay, these people were trying as hard as they could to let God off the hook and demonstrate that, what was fulfilled or what was promised was truly fulfilled, when they may not have had any real evidence of that. And they documented things they wanted to pass off as evidence. But to me, and not being an eyewitness, that doesn't resonate with me at all. You see other religions, do the same sort of thing. So, for me, I needed something deeper just to even believe Christianity. Okay, because I didn't see anything that was fulfilled or that was claimed to be fulfilled that really seemed like a credible fulfillment. It sounded more like an excuse to me. So, anyways, I wanted to say that, okay, because if people don't wonder why I don't get into those sorts of debates and those details and stuff, it's because I think they're a total dead end. Okay, and I think regardless of what side you're on those particular points, I think it's inconclusive, and regardless of where you settle, it impacts the credibility of Christianity. Okay, one way or the other. Now, we were going to talk about Matthew 24, but Mike, you had mentioned earlier about Matthew 16, 27 through 28, I believe, right? You wanted to talk about that passage? Is that
Well,
correct?
just point out the tense about him about to come in the Greek, but that's it.
Right,
Yeah.
right. Okay, well, that's actually another passage. It's a key time statement, the preterist Jews, that I would argue is not just a time statement, that is another example of a play on words. So if you guys don't mind, I might spend a little time just talking about that a little bit, because I think it plays into this, and it kind of it's another example that would give us an indication that Jesus was saying more, intentionally saying more than what many people have actually thought he was saying there.
Go ahead.
So if
Go
I
ahead.
just go there and read that. Matthew 16, 27 through 28. For the Son of Man is going to come in the Father's glory with his angels, and then he will reward each person according to what they have done. Truly, I tell you, some who are standing here will not taste death before they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. Okay, so that's clearly a time statement in some sense. Okay. No, what I would argue, though, is that it's not just a time statement. Just as I claimed with Matthew 24 and the passages about the generation in the temple and Jesus' words passing away there. There's another way we can understand what Jesus is saying here, and it's an apocalyptic play on words. When he says there are some standing here who will not taste death, a natural way to take that is that he's just saying those people will not physically die before they see the Son of Man coming. I'm not saying that's not a valid way to read that, but another way that can be read is it ties in with 1 Corinthians 15:54, where Paul is saying
life.
that
That is summer life.
sorry, somebody saying something?
No, I was just trying to help you. I said they will not all sleep, but will be awake. That will be changed. That if you read in 1 Corinthians 15.
Right. Well, this particular passage, though, is about the swallowing of death. Right.
Okay.
If I have the quotation or the citation right
Mhm.
here, it says that death will be swallowed up in victory. Okay. And in Revelation, we have the same image. You have death being cast into the second death. Okay, and it's being swallowed up by the lake of fire. Okay, so it's an important image, as it relates to eschatology. So what I think Jesus was also doing here was he was playing on the biblical image of, in the eschatological biblical image of God's armies devouring their enemies. And what he's saying here is there's some standing here who will not so much as taste of death in the act of swallowing it with him until the Son of Man comes, making it another statement of the necessity of Christ's coming. Okay, so if you need references for passages that where God's armies are actually devouring his enemies, you could look at Ezekiel 18:20 and Revelation 19:17 through 18. Very very close to the proximity of the death being swallowed up. You have God's armies devouring other kings, other people, in a sense. So what I think Jesus is doing here, in perfect alignment with what I claimed he did in Matthew 24 with passing away, is saying that there are some standing here who will not participate with Jesus in the swallowing of death until the Son of Man comes. That was absolutely necessary. They could not conquer death without Jesus returning. Okay, so from that perspective, it doesn't say anything about time, and I want to emphasize that I'm not denying it's a time statement, but it's a pun. It's a prophetic pun where Jesus is saying more than just that. That much I don't think can reasonably be denied. I think the challenge for a preterist would be to explain that in the context of what they believe. If what is the purpose of Jesus doing this? And these aren't the only two examples of this. There's another popular preterist time statement.
Carmine, hey Carmine,
Yeah.
why not just say it's a dual prophecy? Because 27 is
Because
talking about the second coming, and 28 is talking about 70 AD.
right, the key is evidence. There has to be evidence, and that's what Michael was emphasizing
Well, the
earlier.
evidence
You've
is
gotta,
there's no angels associated with the 70 AD coming. Now you can
there
get
aren't.
technical. There's no angels associated with the 70 degree.
Well, what
70 degree.
about the armies in the
70
sky? I mean,
AD, right?
what
There's
about
no
the
angels.
armies that Josephus and the other Roman authors or
Now there's
historians document?
typology. Yeah, there is typologies. Yes. So you can,
But
but
that's the
but
proof.
there's also
That's
a
the key.
typology in calling the. You can also say it's a typology like what Chilton does. He says that after the tribulation, the gospel is preached by the elect are gathered out from the four winds, and he's talking about that's the preaching of the gospel.
Right. But
Well, there's different
that's the
ways.
thing, though. Typology,
Yeah,
it's easy. It's easy to claim that something is a type.
yeah,
Okay, that's
and
a
it can
criticism
be
I would
more than
launch
one
against
type.
any. This is a criticism I would launch against Christians themselves whenever they cite passages like Isaiah 7 as is it or 7:14 or whatever, the virgin birth prophecy. They blindly just assign, go with Matthew on his interpretation of that and say that was a type, and
Right.
just that's it. We just believe that Matthew was right. That was a type. We're not going to question him on it, and they just accept it.
So why not
I'm
say
all
you
for
have a
typology.
foreshadowing? Why not say that's a foreshadowing, a typology of the birth of Christ? But
Well, you
it
can
was
say it.
it was an actual event that took place in
Well, but
Isaiah's time.
you can say that, but
Right.
where is the contextual evidence that Isaiah had any of that in mind? Look
Because
at the
it really
text.
happened.
I don't want to get into an exegesis on on Isaiah 7:14, but that passage is not at all about the Messiah. You have to take the New Testament authority for granted to accept that prophecy is a type, and I'm not
Do I think
disagreeing that there
Isaiah
are
knew
types,
it?
but
No, I don't think Isaiah knew. I don't think Isaiah
Come
knew.
on, come on, I agree with you.
but
So either way.
that's the
So
I
problem.
think we all agree with you.
no,
Okay,
I
so how do you
disagree.
solve that
I
problem?
disagree that there is no
But we're trying to
clear
wind things
evidence
down
in
for
Isaiah
feeling.
to
Isaiah didn't
suggest
know. I
that is
don't
the
think
type.
Isaiah knew.
That's
I'm not worried
another
about
discussion,
Isaiah.
guys. That's a
I'm
Right,
not
and that's
totally
worried.
Isaiah 7:14. That's that we could do that, another time. But
I'm
right.
not worried about what
we gotta
Isaiah
wrap
Not an
this
believes.
up.
isolated
All
case.
right, guys,
Yeah,
let's try
we
to wrap
gotta
it up. Carmine, just
we
land.
gotta wrap it up.
We'll go around the room.
Excellent
Okay.
points. Let's just do some closing statements. Carmine, go ahead, give a quick closing statement, and then we'll go to Michael, Martin, and then Jeff.
All right, the quick closing statement. Let me just finish the thought that I had there about the types. I want to say that the New Testament authors, Isaiah 7:14 is not an isolated case. They did this repeatedly. The authors of the New Testament, in fact, the majority of the case that they made for Jesus being the Messiah promised in the Old Testament was done using prophecies that were taken completely out of context with no justification whatsoever. They just put it out there, said this was a fulfillment of that. And I think that's a real problem for Christians, and they want to sweep it under the rug. And so I see that as a real problem for Christianity. But then if we're going to argue against full preterists using types, okay, we still got the same problem. We need some sort of evidence, compelling evidence, that if we're going to say there's a type involved, you need some legitimate explanation. It can't be that it could be, okay? It needs to be, it is because of this. This is the evidence that this is a type. And that's why I place such an emphasis on these puns and plays on words. I think there's a lot of value to be gained in them from multiple perspectives, but it was ultimately these things that not only brought me back to Christianity as evidence, the most compelling evidence that the Bible was actually divine in origin, but I had to reject full preterism as well, because some of these things are so tightly ingrained with that I just could see that there actually was a dual fulfillment intended, and because of that, I couldn't make it fit with full preterism.
Thanks, Carmine. I'll make it quick. I got to run too, but Fiona, thank you, gentlemen. Thank you for the opportunity to partake in the platform. So, listen, I do hold a fulfilled eschatology. I'm always learning, but for me, it's fulfilled eschatology that's kind of offered, saved the credibility of the New Testament. If Jesus didn't return in some sense as parousia in 70 AD, then yeah, this, to my mind, is a failed apocalyptic mission movement. I think it's a beautiful story. I really do. Fulfilled eschatology, when you read it, first of all, it's not written to us. When I read the story about this generation, about the arriving of a kingdom that's not made with hands, it's made clear the kingdom is not of this world. I know we get a lot of slack for full preterists for this kind of spiritualizing, but that's what Jesus did. Paul says when he speaks and he gives uses this language, 1 Thessalonians 4 and other texts, he says he's appealing or speaking about spiritual realities using spiritual words. And I think there is something to the fact that we knock spirituality or the spirit, but it's what made the physical world. I think this idea of a spiritual kingdom within, as representative of the temple of God, again, it saved the credibility of the New Testament. It's reinvigorated my faith, encouraged my faith. And regarding Matthew 24, it seems wherever we get to this text, we always veer off. But it's, to me, again, it's a beautiful picture of fulfilled promises and prophecies when you understand the parousia in the context of the Septuagint, where the Messiah would be killed, he'll return. But I see it all like in the lens of Daniel. So I think the New Testament is basically storylines and narratives of what was, Paul says, dark and dimly, and John says he don't even know what they're going to be. So I agree with Carmine. There is some sort of ambiguity or kind of different pictures being painted. But ultimately, I think that all this is really taking place in the mind and providence and will of God, which is Daniel 7, where it's a heavenly scene. It's a heavenly judicial process. Ultimately, I just see it as a transference of covenant control in the government from the Roman and Jewish regimes in the first century to Christ and the saints. And in actuality, if you look at a map from 30 to 70, legitimately that known world was completely Christianized and under Christian control in 600 AD. So I see a lot of fulfillment taking place. But dealing with the East and the West, yeah, Roman armies, because that was kind of the point of the format. And I asked this question: if all these elements were fulfilled, and within that generation, why would we look for another? Hope deferred makes the heart sick, but a fulfilled promise is a tree of life. This has given me nothing but life, guys. So God bless you.
Okay, great. So Martin, let's have a closing statement. Can we make it like around 2-3 minutes,
Yes.
and then we'll go to Jeff?
Yeah. So for me, I would say that Matthew 24 is an expanded context. It gives an expanded context for what the Olivet Discourse is, and it shows that it has extended to the coming of the Lord at the end of the age, which is the very day of the separation judgment and the judgment of all the nations, the end of the Gog and Magog war, which is exactly the end of the millennium, when death and Hades are all done with. And because of that, both the coming of the Lord at the end of the age is going to bring it will bring the consummate kingdom, and the coming in 87, he also brought the expansion of the kingdom, which Jesus brought to just the Gentiles, to just Jew. And because both ideas have to do with the coming of the kingdom, the same prophecy dealing with the kingdom coming in relationship to all the world until its end after AD 70 in particular, which has that signs being universalized until the judgment of all the nations, as Matthew 25 is talking about. That same signs are also on a limited, localized form, seen in the very reality of Rome coming against, the end of those realities of warfare against God's people. We saw, for instance, the church in Israel being persecuted, and God coming and bringing judgment against those who persecuted them, just like it will be at the end when the universal church is hated by all the nations. Christ will come with his armies, who are the holy ones, and what he will do is he will judge them as those who were being governed by the beast who was ruling all the nations. So based on that, what I see is one prophecy of the coming kingdom, but it has a larger fulfillment for all the world until the end of the age, and a limited fulfillment until AD 70 in relationship to just Israel. And so because of that, Matthew 24 and 25 are dealing with the same coming of the Lord. Only thing is, it's largely driven by the coming at the end of the age, which is the universal. And based on Luke 21 and Mark 13, it shows that these same signs are also on the limited scope and in also typological ways applied to Israel, so that Israel is the type of all the gathered nations who were against the church at the coming of Christ in Revelation 19. And the beast, which is the ruler of all the nations, he is typified by the high priest of Israel. And those who were Sanhedrin, they were the type of all the nations, the kings of the nations that are going to rule with the beast, as we see in Revelation. So based on that, Matthew 24, 25 being one prophecy, contained one prophecy applied locally to Israel and then universally to the world. And that is still to come. And that's why the gospel still goes on. And that's why the millennium has not ended, and death is still here, and all the enemies are still here, because they have not been completely ended until Jesus will come again. So
Yeah.
that's it.
Okay, Jeff, close us out, man.
Okay. Well, no matter how much we don't like typologies and how they can be misused, the problem is the whole scripture is full of typologies and motifs. So the only way to truly, we have to be honest about them. And sometimes we don't always know. But with that motif of the light shining in the darkness, that's a strong motif. That's Isaiah 9, right? Where Jesus' birth is described using Isaiah 9:2 and Isaiah 7:14. But in Isaiah 9:2, talking about light shining in the darkness. Let me just put this out there. Has darkness been eliminated? Are there still people doing deeds of darkness? Or has that totally been done away with by 70 AD? That's if you look at my paper I sent you guys and see if you agree. But it says the lamp of the prophetic word is still shining in a dark place and will continue to do so until the morning star arises in our hearts. So the morning star came with Jesus' first advent, but the morning star will come again in Revelation 22:16. And in between, the restoration is all about the gospel. When the gospel, when it has been preached in all the world, then the end will come. You can talk about it. I don't have a problem with saying that the gospel was preached in all the known world of the Roman world, but you can't say the known world, but the civilized world, perhaps you could say that it was preached in all the civilized world. But that just shows you that it's an incomplete fulfillment because it wasn't preached in every nation. And it's when full preterism and partial preterism, they totally dismiss the partial fulfillments. And then they don't answer the questions like, well, how did the beast come up out of the abyss? How did the beast get put into the abyss in the first place? Nobody answers that question. When I started thinking about that, then I realized I finally realized what was going on. There had to be a bridge between the first century and the end of time. And that's what it is. It's the beast coming up out of the abyss. And then we have a tribulation period that takes place, which is much greater and fuller than the tribulation that took place because it encompasses the entire world. I mean, it just shows you. I don't understand. If people would ask themselves that question, when does the beast come up out of the abyss? And how did he get there in the first place? I think that would go a long way to solving our problem because premillennialists don't do it and preterists don't do it. So I don't think we can say that Revelation is fulfilled.
I'll give you an answer to that in an email, Jeff.
Okay.
All right,
Yeah.
guys. Well, thanks. This has been a great discussion. Thanks, everybody. Let's do this soon. We'll do one on, I don't know, you guys pick.
Thank you, Phelan. Really appreciate it.
All right. Well, thank you. You guys have a great 4th of July.
Bye.